Thick, unyielding cardstock dug into the pad of Nora's thumb. She stared at the gold foil embossing until the cursive letters blurred into meaningless, glittering loops. The Harrington family cordially invites you to the annual spring gala. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. It was a beautifully crafted, violently expensive middle finger delivered directly to her mailbox. Bile rose in the back of her throat, tasting sharp and metallic, like pennies in stale coffee. She dropped the envelope onto the scarred wooden workbench of her restoration studio. The card landed beside a cracked porcelain saucer holding dirty turpentine, the juxtaposition painfully fitting. Everything about her life now smelled of harsh solvents, old dust, and survival. Everything about Preston's life, her ex-husband, the golden son of the Harrington real estate empire, smelled of success, expensive gardenias, and moving on. 14 months. It had been exactly 14 months since the divorce papers were finalized in a sterile downtown office. Evelyn, Preston's mother, had worn a pristine white Chanel suit to the signing, a sartorial choice that screamed victory. Nora had worn a sensible gray blazer that smelled faintly of dry cleaning fluid, her stomach twisting into painful, tight knots. "They want me to decline," Nora muttered to the empty room, her voice sounding raspy, unused. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. The mechanics of the cruelty were breathtakingly simple. If she RSVP'd no, she was the bitter, defeated ex-wife hiding in her dingy apartment. If she RSVP'd yes, she was the pathetic hanger-on, showing up alone to a room full of people who had actively placed bets on how quickly her marriage would fail. They had invited her purely to parade Preston's new fiancé, a 24-year-old heiress named Harper, in front of her, to watch Nora bleed in public. A heavy knock sounded on the frosted glass of her studio door, jarring her out of the spiral. The brass knob turned. Before she could speak, the hinges groaning. "I was told there would be coffee, or at the very least, a passable cup of Earl Grey," a low, distinctly clipped voice announced. Henry pushed the door open, bringing a gust of damp London air with him. He was a tall man, all sharp angles and quiet authority, wearing a battered waxed cotton jacket that somehow looked more regal than a bespoke tuxedo. Raindrops clung to his dark, silver-flecked hair. He shook his umbrella out with a quick, snapping motion, leaving a puddle on her worn floorboards. Henry Arthur Cavendish, the Duke of Ashbourne. He was also, by a strange twist of fate, her best client. He owned an estate in Sussex, filled with rotting, priceless 17th century portraits that he was slowly, stubbornly paying Nora to restore. He didn't act like a duke. He rarely used the title, preferring to blend into the damp woodwork of the city. He smelled of rain-soaked wool, expensive pipe tobacco, and something faintly metallic. "I have instant coffee," Nora said, wiping her hands on her stained denim apron. "And it's stale." "I expected nothing less from this establishment," Henry murmured, walking past her canvases. He stopped at her workbench. His pale gray eyes, usually detached and amused, fell on the thick, cream-colored envelope. He didn't touch it. He merely leaned over, reading the script. The silence in the studio thickened, broken only by the rhythmic, hollow dripping of the radiator in the corner. "Harrington," Henry read, tasting the word as if it were slightly rotten. "The property developers, the ones who buy historical buildings and gut them to install floating staircases." "That's them," Nora said, turning away to fiddle with a jar of varnish. Her hands were shaking. She hated that he saw it. She hated that her body betrayed her. It's Preston's family. Ah. Henry straightened up. He looked at her back, his gaze heavy and assessing. The infamous Preston. The man who left you for a girl whose brain hasn't fully finished developing. Nora let out a wet, jagged laugh. Yes, and they've invited me to their spring gala. To celebrate their engagement, though the card doesn't explicitly state it. Evelyn is too subtle for that. She isn't subtle, Nora. She's just rich, Henry corrected mildly. He picked up the invitation, his long, calloused fingers handling the heavy paper as if it were a cheap flyer. Are you going? Of course not. Nora turned around, leaning against the counter. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly feeling very small, very fragile under her oversized sweater. I'd rather drink this turpentine. If I go, I'm the sad ex-wife. If I don't, I'm the coward. I can't win. The game is rigged. Henry was quiet for a long moment. He reached into the pocket of his damp jacket and pulled out a silver cigarette case, turning it over in his hands. He didn't smoke, not anymore, but it was a nervous habit he kept. The problem with rigged games, Henry said slowly, his voice dropping an octave, rich and dangerously calm, is that the people who rig them never expect someone to flip the entire table. Nora frowned, the skin between her eyebrows pulling tight. What does that mean? He looked up, his pale eyes catching the harsh fluorescent light overhead. It means you are going, and you are not going alone. Nora's breath hitched. A strange, vibrating tension filled the gap between them. Henry, no, you don't know these people. They are vicious. They hunt for sport in ballrooms. They will look at your frayed coat and my tired face, and they will eat us alive. Let them try, he said softly. A cold, feral smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile inherited from centuries of ancestors who had sent men to die for a scrap of land. I have a tuxedo that isn't frayed, and you, Nora, are going to wear something that makes them feel very, very small. He tossed the invitation back onto the workbench. It landed face down. Pick me up at 8 on Saturday, Henry instructed, turning back toward the door. Actually, don't. I'll send the car. We wouldn't want you chipping your nail polish on the steering wheel. Henry, she called out, panic rising hot and fast in her chest. Why are you doing this? He paused with his hand on the doorknob. For a second, the aristocratic armor slipped, and he looked incredibly tired, profoundly human. Because I detest bullies, Nora. And because I have spent the last 6 months watching you scrape centuries of grime off my family's legacy with more care than my own mother ever showed me. You deserve a good evening. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Nora alone with the smell of wet wool, the ticking radiator, and a terrifying, unfamiliar spark of adrenaline. Slick, black leather squeaked beneath Nora's shifting weight. The interior of the vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom was cavernous, smelling of rich mahogany polish and aged petrol, a scent that instantly separated it from the sterile, plastic-scented luxury cars Preston always leased. Outside, the London streets blurred into a smear of yellow streetlights and rain-slicked pavement. The tires hissed over the wet asphalt. Nora's palms were sweating. She rubbed them discreetly against the rough velvet of her clutch, feeling the sharp edges of the rhinestone clasp dig into her skin. Her stomach churned, a volatile mix of dread and nausea. She was breathing too fast, the air catching high in her chest. "Breathe, Nora. You're fogging the glass," Henry murmured from the shadows beside her. He was a silhouette in the dim cabin, save for the occasional flash of passing streetlights that illuminated his profile. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo, the wool so fine it looked liquid. The tailoring was flawless, lacking the stiff, rented look of the men Nora was used to. It sat on his broad shoulders with casual indifference. He didn't look like he was going to a party. He looked like he was going to a war room. Nora looked down at her own lap. She had spent money she didn't have on a vintage, structured gown. It wasn't ethereal or romantic. It was severe, architectural, made of heavy, forest green silk that felt like armor. The bodice squeezed her ribs, forcing her posture perfectly straight. A slit ran up the thigh, practical rather than provocative. She felt alien in it. She felt like an imposter. "I can't do this," she whispered, the words tumbling out raw and broken. "Henry, tell the driver to turn around. I'm going to be sick. Evelyn is going to look at my shoes, and she'll know they're from last season, and Preston is going to give me that pitying, lopsided smile, and I will shatter. I swear to God, I will shatter right there on the marble." Henry didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her she looked beautiful or that everything would be fine. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a heavy silver flask, unscrewed the cap, and pressed it into her trembling hands. "Drink," he commanded. Nora brought it to her lips. The brandy was older than she was, burning a bright, fiery path down her throat. It hit her stomach like a heavy stone, anchoring her instantly. She coughed, eyes watering, and handed it back. "They have power over you only because you agree to the rules of their currency," Henry said, capping the flask. He turned his head, finally looking at her fully. His eyes were hard, piercing in the gloom. They trade in labels, in leased cars, in the illusion of relevance. "It's a desperately fragile ecosystem, Nora. You are walking in there tonight, completely outside of it. You aren't playing their game. You are entirely different weather." Before she could process the weight of his words, the car slowed. The tires transitioned from smooth asphalt to the loud, crunching rhythm of crushed gravel. The Harrington estate. Nora's heart hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. The estate loomed at the end of the long driveway, a monstrous neoclassical structure lit up by hundreds of harsh spotlights. It looked like a museum that had swallowed a nightclub. Valets in crisp white jackets darted like frantic moths around a line of idling Ferraris, Bentleys, and Mercedes. Their Rolls-Royce pulled up to the grand entrance. The idle of the massive engine was a deep, guttural purr that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. A valet stepped forward, his eyes darting to the vintage car with a flicker of confusion. He reached for the handle, opening the door. The immediate assault of the party rushed in. The muffled, thumping bass of a string quartet amplified through modern speakers. The overpowering, cloying scent of hundreds of imported white roses and the sharp bite of the cold night air. Henry stepped out first. He moved with a lazy, predatory grace. He didn't look at the valet. He didn't look at the mansion. He turned, offering his hand into the dark cabin. Nora stared at his palm. It was wide, the skin calloused from years of riding and fencing, totally at odds with the diamond-encrusted cufflink gleaming at his wrist. She took a breath. The corset of her dress pushed the air out in a sharp exhale. She placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, solid, and utterly immovable, she stepped out onto the gravel. Her heels crunched. The flash of a photographer's bulb near the doorway, hired by Evelyn, no doubt, for the society pages, momentarily blinded her. She flinched, instinctively pulling back. Henry stepped smoothly into her line of sight, blocking the camera. He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm. Through the layers of fine wool, she could feel the hard, steady heat of his arm. "Head up," he instructed softly, close to her ear. "Don't look at their faces. Look at their foreheads. It makes you appear intensely bored." Nora swallowed hard. She adjusted her grip on her clutch. She locked her jaw, feeling the muscles bunch near her ears. Together, they walked up the wide stone steps. The heavy mahogany doors were held open by 2 staff members. As they crossed the threshold, the warmth of the foyer hit them. It was a cavernous space, dripping with crystal chandeliers that cast fractured, kaleidoscopic light across the polished marble floor. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, expensive perfume, and the sour tang of nervous sweat masked by deodorant. To their left, a woman with a clipboard and a headset stood behind a velvet rope. "The guest list." "Name?" the woman asked, her tone flat, her eyes already scanning Nora's dress with a practiced, calculating judgment. She recognized Nora. A tiny, cruel smirk played at the corner of the woman's glossy lips. "Ah, Nora, you didn't RSVP. She is with me," Henry said. His voice didn't rise in volume, but it carried a strange acoustic weight that made the woman blink and look up. "And you are?" the woman asked, pen hovering over the paper. Henry didn't answer immediately. He looked at the woman, then past her into the sprawling ballroom where hundreds of guests milled about like a school of glittering, poisonous fish. "Cavendish," he finally said, the syllables dropping like heavy coins onto a glass table. "Arthur Henry Cavendish." The woman frowned, running her pen down the printed list. "I don't see a Cavendish. Were you invited by Mrs. Harrington?" Henry leaned forward, just a fraction. "I believe the Harrington firm is currently bidding on the leasehold for the Southwark development. Are they not?" The woman, clearly out of her depth regarding corporate real estate, stammered. I'm just the door coordinator, sir." "Then, coordinate," Henry said smoothly, lacking any heat or anger. It was the terrifying, polite command of a man who had never been told no in his life. "Tell Evelyn Harrington that the owner of the Southwark land is here. I'm sure she'll find room." The woman paled. She scrambled for a blank line at the bottom of the list, scribbling furiously. Nora felt a hysterical bubble of laughter rise in her throat. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper to suppress it. Henry guided her past the velvet rope, his stride perfectly matching hers, leading her directly into the lion's den. The ballroom was a sea of silk, velvet, and suffocating tension. A massive ice sculpture of a swan dominated the center of the room, slowly weeping cold water into a silver basin. Waiters drifted through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne, moving with the synchronized caution of soldiers navigating a minefield. Nora's peripheral vision narrowed. She felt hyper-aware of every sound: the clinking of crystal, the sharp, barking laughter of men in tuxedos, the rustle of heavy taffeta. "Keep moving," Henry murmured against her temple, steering her smoothly through the throng. "Target spotted at 2:00. Do not alter your pace." Nora's eyes flicked to the right. There they were, the royal family of this particular pathetic kingdom. Preston stood by the fireplace, one hand casually tucked into his trouser pocket, the other holding a lowball glass of amber liquid. He looked exactly the same. His hair was perfectly coiffed, his jawline sharp, his smile practiced and easy. Clinging to his arm was Harper. She was terrifyingly young, wearing a dress made of what looked like spun silver that clung to every curve. She looked vibrant, untainted, and deeply naive. And next to them, holding court, was Evelyn. Evelyn Harrington wore a gown of deep plum, her neck dripping with diamonds that caught the light like shards of broken glass. Her face was a testament to expensive dermatology, smooth, tight, and completely devoid of warmth. As Nora and Henry approached, Evelyn's head snapped toward them. The predatory instinct in the older woman was instantaneous. Nora saw the exact moment Evelyn recognized her. The woman's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed into slits. A slow, chilling smile spread across her blood-red lips. Evelyn tapped Preston's arm. Preston turned. Nora felt her lungs seize. Seeing him in photographs was one thing. Breathing the same air, smelling the faint trace of his sandalwood cologne that drifted across the 10 feet separating them, was a physical blow. 1,000 memories, screaming matches in the kitchen, cold silences in bed. The specific way he sighed when she disappointed him rushed her mind. She stumbled slightly, her heel catching on a thick Persian rug. Henry's arm instantly flexed, a band of steel catching her weight before she even registered the fall. He didn't look down. He just tightened his grip, anchoring her to the earth. "Steady," he breathed. They stopped 3 feet from the Harrington enclave. The conversation around them died a sudden, unnatural death. The silence rippled outward as nearby guests turned, smelling blood in the water. "Nora," Evelyn purred, her voice carrying the theatrical projection of a stage actor. "My goodness, we didn't think you'd actually come. You didn't return the card, darling." "Evelyn," Nora managed, her voice remarkably level despite the violent trembling in her chest. "The mail is so unreliable lately. I assumed my presence was a given." Preston stepped forward. His eyes swept over Nora, taking in the severe green dress, the lack of jewelry, the pale tension in her face. He gave her that familiar, condescending smile, the one that always made her feel like a slow child. "Nora," Preston said smoothly, "it's good to see you getting out of that depressing little apartment. Really." He turned slightly, pulling Harper forward. "This is Harper. I don't believe you two ever crossed paths." Harper smiled, a wide, vacuous expression. "Oh, hi. Preston has told me so much about you. It's so brave of you to come." Brave. The word was a dagger, disguised as a ribbon. Nora opened her mouth, but her throat was completely dry. The script she had rehearsed vanished. She was drowning in the sheer, overwhelming reality of their smugness. Before the silence could stretch into a humiliation, Henry stepped slightly in front of Nora, altering the physical dynamic of the circle. He didn't look at Preston. He didn't look at Harper. He looked directly at Evelyn. "Mrs. Harrington," Henry said. His tone was perfectly polite, yet it carried an unmistakable note of profound boredom. Evelyn's gaze snapped to him. She assessed his tuxedo, his lack of recognizable jewelry, his rugged, unimpressed face. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" "I wasn't aware Nora was bringing a +1. A terrible oversight on her part, I'm sure," Henry replied, his lips curving into that faint, feral smile. "I insisted on joining her. I was quite curious to see the architecture of this house. One hears so much about the Harrington taste." Preston bristled at the subtle insult. He took a step toward Henry, puffing out his chest in a primitive display of dominance. "And who exactly are you? A friend from Nora's little painting club?" Henry finally looked at Preston. The Duke's pale gray eyes swept over the younger man with the slow, detached interest of a scientist observing a mildly annoying insect. "Not quite," Henry said. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the silver cigarette case, and snapped it open with a sharp, echoing click. He didn't take one out. He simply ran his thumb over the engraved crest on the front. "My name is Henry Cavendish. Though, when your lawyers send me those desperate, groveling letters begging to buy my land in Southwark, they usually address me as the Duke of Ashbourne." The effect was not an explosion. It was an implosion. All the air seemed to instantly vanish from the immediate radius. Evelyn's mouth parted, a sharp intake of breath hissing past her teeth. The Botoxed muscles in her forehead strained as her brain desperately tried to compute the information. Ashbourne. It was old money. The kind of money that made the Harrington real estate empire look like a lemonade stand. It was power that didn't need to shout, didn't need to put its name on buildings, because it owned the dirt the building sat on. Preston's face drained of color, leaving his tan looking suddenly sallow and artificial. He stared at the silver case, at the heavy crest, and then up at Henry's bored, unforgiving eyes. "Your Grace," Evelyn choked out, the honorific tasting like ash in her mouth. Her entire posture changed, crumbling from a queen to a sycophant in less than a second. I had no idea. If we had known you were accompanying Nora, you would have what, Mrs. Harrington?" Henry interrupted softly, snapping the case shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet circle. "Put out better champagne? Or perhaps you would have refrained from treating my date like an inconvenience you stepped in." He offered his arm back to Nora. She placed her hand on it, feeling a sudden, dizzying rush of power. "Come, Nora," Henry said, his voice carrying clearly to the eavesdropping crowd. "The air in here is incredibly stale. Let's find somewhere with a better class of conversation." Without waiting for a response from the paralyzed Harringtons, Henry turned on his heel, pulling Nora gently but firmly with him into the parting crowd. Marble gave way to a plush, suffocatingly thick carpet that absorbed the sharp click of Nora's heels. Henry steered her away from the ballroom, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the Harrington estate with an infuriatingly innate sense of direction. The thumping bass of the string quartet faded into a muffled, rhythmic heartbeat behind them. They ducked into a library. It was a vast, circular room, lined with mahogany shelves, holding books that smelled distinctively of fresh leather and neglect. Nobody actually read in this room. It was a set piece, smelling of lemon polish and stale dust mites. Henry closed the heavy oak doors behind them, the brass latch clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the quiet space. Immediately, the invisible strings holding Nora upright snapped. Her knees buckled. She didn't fall, but she swayed violently, her hand flying out to catch the edge of a heavy claw-footed desk. Her lungs, which had been paralyzed for the last 10 minutes, suddenly demanded oxygen in rapid, shallow gasps. The corset of her green dress dug mercilessly into her lower ribs, turning every breath into a sharp, localized ache. "Put your head between your knees," Henry instructed, his voice had lost the theatrical, aristocratic drawl he'd used in the ballroom, returning to the low, gravelly cadence she knew from the studio. "I'm fine," Nora lied, her voice cracking. She wasn't fine. Her skin felt too tight for her body. The coppery taste of adrenaline coated the back of her throat, thick and nauseating. She pressed the heels of her hands against her closed eyes, seeing bursts of white light against the dark behind her eyelids. She was humiliated by her own biology. She wanted to be a stone column of vengeance, but instead, she was a trembling, sweating mess. Henry didn't argue. He crossed the room, the faint rustle of his worsted wool trousers the only sound. He bypassed the decorative globe and went straight for a cut crystal decanter sitting on a side table. Liquid sloshed heavily into a glass. "Drink," he said, pressing the cold, heavy crystal against her knuckles until she opened her hand to take it. It was whiskey. It tasted like smoke, peat, and raw ethanol. She choked on the first sip, the liquid burning a hot trail down her esophagus, but it forced her lungs to expand, shocking her system back into a normal rhythm. She looked up at him. He was leaning against the edge of the desk, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching her with those pale, analytical eyes. Anger, sudden and blindingly hot, flared in Nora's chest. It was an easier emotion than panic. It felt like a weapon. "You didn't do that for me," Nora snapped, setting the glass down onto the leather-topped desk with a sharp thud. A drop of amber liquid splashed onto the polished surface. "You did that for yourself. You used me as a prop to flex your ridiculous title in front of people you despise." Henry didn't flinch. He didn't offer a polite, defensive apology. He merely tilted his head, a lock of silver-flecked hair falling across his forehead. "Is that what you think?" he asked, his tone maddeningly even. "What else am I supposed to think?" Nora's voice rose, echoing off the unread spines of the books. "You walked in there and played Lord of the Manor. You reduced Preston to a stuttering idiot, and you made Evelyn bow and scrape. But you didn't change the game, Henry. You just proved you own the board." She pushed away from the desk, pacing a short, frantic line across the Persian rug. The silk of her dress swished aggressively around her ankles. "They looked at me exactly the same way," Nora continued, her throat tight with unshed tears. "I wasn't Nora, the woman who survived their son. I was just the unfortunate girl attached to the Duke of Ashbourne's arm. I was an accessory." Again, silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. A floorboard creaked somewhere above their heads. The faint smell of rain on Henry's coat mixed with the stale air of the room. Henry pulled his hands from his pockets. He stepped into her path, stopping her frantic pacing. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a physical barrier. He was a head taller than her, a solid mass of quiet, unyielding gravity. "Nora," he said softly. The anger bled out of the syllable, leaving only a brutal, surgical honesty. "If I had walked in there as Henry, the patron of the arts, Evelyn Harrington would have smiled, offered me a cheap canapé, and then spent the next hour systematically shredding your self-worth, disguised as polite concern. She would have asked how your little painting business was doing. She would have made sure every person in that room knew you were wearing last season's shoes." Nora flinched. He had vocalized exactly what she had feared. In the car, "Bullies do not understand morality, Nora. They do not understand growth or resilience or the quiet dignity of surviving," Henry continued, his eyes locked onto hers. They only understand leverage. I didn't use my title to diminish you. I used it to deafen them." He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the rigid silk covering her shoulder. The touch was feather-light, entirely at odds with the hardness in his face. "I made them look at me so they would stop looking at you," he finished. "I gave you a shield. What you do with the sword is entirely up to you." Nora stared at his chest, watching the slow, even rise and fall of his breathing beneath the starched white shirt. The anger in her chest flickered, starved of oxygen, and slowly died, leaving behind a cold, hollow clarity. He was right. Evelyn hadn't been able to land a single poisoned compliment. Preston hadn't been able to offer his sickening pity. Henry had dropped a bomb in the center of their carefully curated social hierarchy, and the fallout had given Nora room to breathe. "They're going to come looking for us," Nora said, her voice finally dropping to a normal register. She picked up the whiskey glass and took another, smaller sip. The burn was manageable this time. "Let them," Henry replied, a dark amusement returning to his eyes. "Evelyn is currently recalculating her entire social strategy. She's probably in a bathroom somewhere, frantically Googling the extent of the Ashbourne estate holdings while trying not to ruin her mascara." A startled, genuine laugh punched its way out of Nora's throat. It sounded foreign to her own ears, a rough, unpolished sound. "There it is," Henry murmured, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "I was beginning to think I'd have to pour that entire decanter down your throat to get a smile." Before Nora could formulate a response, the heavy brass handle of the library door depressed with a sharp, squeaking grind. Both of them turned. The heavy oak swung inward, revealing a wedge of bright, jarring light from the hallway. Standing in the threshold, looking entirely out of place in her spun silver dress, was Harper. Preston's new fiancée hovered in the doorway like a startled bird. Up close, the illusion of her pristine, untouchable glamour fractured. Her makeup was flawless, yes, but her eyes, wide and rimmed with a faint, shiny redness, betrayed a frantic, vibrating anxiety. She smelled overpoweringly of a sweet, generic vanilla perfume, entirely masking whatever natural scent she might possess. Harper's gaze darted from Henry, leaning casually against the desk, to Nora, holding the half-empty glass of whiskey. I'm sorry," Harper stammered, her voice breathless and high-pitched. She took a step back into the corridor. "I didn't mean to intrude. Preston is looking for... Evelyn wanted me to find..." She trailed off, hopelessly tangled in her own excuses. Nora felt a strange, cold sensation wash over her. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't even jealousy. It was a deeply unsettling sense of déjà vu. She knew that exact posture. She knew the desperate, frantic need to fulfill an order given by Evelyn Harrington. 4 years ago, Nora had been the one scurrying through these same hallways, terrified of being perceived as useless, desperate to earn her place in the family photos. "It's fine, Harper," Nora said. To her surprise, her voice was completely steady. The jagged edges of her panic had smoothed out, filed down by Henry's logic and the stark reality of the girl standing in front of her. "We were just enjoying the quiet." Harper hesitated, then stepped fully into the room, letting the door click shut behind her. The heavy wood severed the noise of the party once again. She wrung her hands together, the massive, emerald-cut diamond on her left ring finger, catching the dim light. The stone was vulgar. It was too heavy for her slender finger, constantly listing to the side. "Preston is furious," Harper blurted out, the words tumbling past her glossy lips before she could stop them. She looked at Henry with a mixture of awe and terror. "He's pacing by the ice sculpture. Evelyn is drinking gin, which she never does in public because of the calories, and she's whispering to the caterers." Henry let out a low, rough chuckle. "A truly tragic tableau. I weep for the swan." Harper blinked, clearly failing to register the sarcasm. She turned her attention back to Nora. The younger woman stepped closer, her silver dress rustling. Up close, Nora could see the fine tremor in Harper's jaw. "He talks about you, you know," Harper said softly, the words rushing out in a confessional spill. Nora stiffened. Her fingers tightened around the crystal glass until her knuckles turned white. "I highly doubt that, Harper." "He does," Harper insisted, taking another step closer. Her eyes flicked toward Henry, then back to Nora, as if checking to see if she was allowed to speak. Not nice things. He tells everyone you were unstable, that you couldn't handle the pressure of the business, that you were trying to bleed him dry in the settlement." The old, familiar shame flared in Nora's gut, hot and toxic. The lies, the carefully constructed narrative Preston had built to justify discarding her when he grew bored. For a second, the urge to defend herself, to scream the truth about his infidelities, and the agonizing, silent control he exerted over every aspect of her life, rose to the back of her teeth. She glanced at Henry. He wasn't looking at Harper. He was looking at Nora. He wasn't stepping in. He was waiting. What you do with the sword is entirely up to you. Nora took a slow, deliberate breath. The air smelled of old paper and the sharp bite of her own whiskey. She looked at Harper, really looked at her. She saw the expensive dress that wore the girl, rather than the girl wearing the dress. She saw the heavy ring acting as a collar. "And do you believe him?" Nora asked quietly. Harper hesitated. Her eyes darted away, staring at a patch of Persian rug. "He's Preston. Why would he lie?" "Why, indeed," Nora murmured. She set the glass down on the desk. The movement was slow, controlled. She walked toward Harper, closing the distance between them. Harper flinched slightly, her shoulders hiking up toward her ears. She expected an attack. She expected the bitter, unstable ex-wife Preston had warned her about. "Harper," Nora said, keeping her voice incredibly soft, dropping the volume so the younger woman had to lean in to hear it. "Listen to me very carefully. You are wearing a very expensive dress, and you have a very heavy stone on your finger. You are currently the golden child of this family." Harper nodded quickly, her eyes wide, desperate for validation. "But you are standing in a room you ran to because you are terrified of making a mistake," Nora continued, her words precise and surgical. "You are sweating through your deodorant because Evelyn looked at you sideways. You are reciting his lies to me because you are trying to convince yourself that you won't end up exactly where I am." Harper's breath hitched. A flush of dark red crept up her neck, clashing violently with her silver gown. "That's not. Preston doesn't love women," Nora cut in, her voice stripping away the last illusion in the room. "Preston loves mirrors. He loved me when I reflected his ambition. And when I stopped reflecting it, he shattered the mirror. Right now, you are reflecting his youth and his power. It feels wonderful, doesn't it?" A single, terrified tear spilled over Harper's lower lash line, cutting a track through her foundation. She didn't wipe it away. "Enjoy the reflection, Harper," Nora whispered, the words tasting like ash, devoid of any joy or triumph. Because the moment you disagree with Evelyn, the moment you decide you want a career, or a thought, or a life that doesn't serve the Harrington Empire, you will become unstable too. Silence descended on the library, heavier than before. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a grave. Harper stared at Nora, her lips parted, her chest heaving against the tight silver fabric. She looked incredibly young. A 24-year-old girl playing dress-up in a house of wolves. Without another word, Harper spun around. Her heels dug frantically into the carpet as she yanked the heavy oak door open and fled back into the suffocating noise of the gala, leaving the door ajar. Nora stood frozen, listening to the frantic clicking of the girl's heels fade down the corridor. She felt hollowed out. There was no victory in tearing down an illusion. There was only a profound, exhausting sadness. "Well," Henry's voice broke the quiet. He pushed himself off the desk, walking slowly toward her. That was ruthlessly efficient. Nora wrapped her arms around her own waist, suddenly freezing cold, despite the heavy silk of her gown. It wasn't ruthless. It was a warning, one she won't heed until it's too late. "Perhaps," Henry said, stopping beside her. He looked out through the open door toward the distant, glittering lights of the ballroom. "But she won't forget it either." He reached out, his knuckles brushing against the side of her arm. It was a grounding touch, warm and solid against the chill of the room. "Are you ready to go back out there?" Henry asked. "Or would you prefer I have the car brought around to the service entrance? We can leave them to their gin and their panic." Nora looked at the open door. Beyond it lay the orchestra, the imported roses, and the people who had tried to bury her. She thought about the workbench in her studio, the smell of turpentine, and the quiet satisfaction of restoring something broken back to its original strength. She turned her head, looking up at the Duke of Ashbourne. His tuxedo was impeccable, but his eyes were ancient and tired, holding a quiet understanding that stripped away the need for pretense. "No," Nora said, her voice dropping lower, finding a new, solid register in her chest. She let her arms fall to her sides, rolling her shoulders back against the confines of the corset. "I didn't put on this armor to retreat through a service door." A slow, genuine smile spread across Henry's face, reaching his eyes and illuminating the stark angles of his jaw. It was a dangerous smile. "Excellent," he murmured, offering his arm once again. "Let's go ruin Evelyn's evening completely." Violin strings snapped and whined over the hum of 100 hushed voices. Nora and Henry's re-entry into the ballroom was not announced, yet the physical shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate. It was as if the air conditioning had violently failed. Conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes darted toward them, heavy with a grotesque, starving curiosity. Nora kept her chin parallel to the floor. The heavy silk of her dress swished against her calves, a steady, rhythmic armor. She felt Henry beside her, a solid wall of midnight blue wool and quiet menace. Evelyn was no longer holding court near the weeping ice swan. She was standing near a towering arrangement of white orchids, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of a high-top table so tightly her knuckles were translucent. Preston stood beside her. He was sweating. A fine sheen of moisture coated his upper lip, and he was aggressively swirling the amber dregs of a drink he had likely been nursing since they retreated to the library. Harper was nowhere to be seen. "Straight through the center," Henry murmured, his breath brushing the shell of Nora's ear. "Make them part for you." They walked. Guests naturally, almost instinctively, stepped backward to clear a path. The crowd parted like a flock of nervous pigeons. Nora didn't look at their faces. She looked at the orchids, focusing on the bruised, browning edges of the petals. Even the Harringtons couldn't pay enough to stop decay. As they closed the distance to the orchids, Preston stepped forward. It was a jerky, uncoordinated movement, lacking his usual practiced swagger. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on a trapdoor. "Nora," Preston said. His voice was too loud, overcompensating for the dead silence surrounding them. He forced a smile that looked painful, stretching the skin tightly across his jaw. "You disappeared. We were worried. I was just telling Mother we should send someone to check the restrooms." He reached out, his hand instinctively going for her forearm, a proprietary gesture he had used 1,000 times to steer her, to quiet her, to claim her in public spaces. Before his fingers could graze the green silk, Nora stopped. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink back. She simply looked down at his outstretched hand with the detached curiosity of someone observing a dead insect on a windowsill. "Don't touch me, Preston," she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. In the absolute quiet of the immediate circle, the words dropped like heavy stones into a shallow pond. Preston's hand hovered in the air, suddenly looking ridiculous and oversized. He let it drop to his side, a dark flush creeping up his neck, swallowing the collar of his tuxedo shirt. "There's no need for a scene, Nora," Preston hissed, stepping closer, desperately trying to lower the volume of the interaction. He smelled of stale scotch and raw panic. "You've made your point. You bagged a title. Congratulations. Now can we please go somewhere private to discuss?" "Discuss what?" Nora interrupted, her voice gaining a resonant clarity she hadn't felt in years. "Your concern for my well-being, or your sudden, terrifying realization that the man standing next to me holds the leasehold to the one development project keeping your father's company solvent this quarter?" A collective, muffled gasp rippled through the nearest eavesdroppers. Evelyn made a choking sound, clapping a hand over her throat as if to physically hold the scandal inside. Preston's eyes darted frantically to Henry, then back to Nora. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate, hollow shell. "Nora, please. We have a history. You know me." "I do know you," Nora said softly. The anger had completely burned out, leaving only a vast, empty landscape of clarity. "I know the exact shape of your cowardice. For 14 months, I thought you broke me. I sat in an apartment that smelled of dust and failure, thinking there was something fundamentally flawed in my design because I wasn't enough for you." She took a half step forward. Preston instinctively took a half step back. "But I look at you now," Nora continued, her eyes scanning his sweating forehead, his trembling jaw, the sheer, naked terror of losing his social standing. "And I realize you are just incredibly small. You are a small, fragile man who needs mirrors and mannequins to feel tall. I didn't fail you, Preston. I outgrew you." Silence hung in the air, absolute and suffocating. Preston opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked to his mother for a lifeline. But Evelyn was staring at Henry, her face a mask of pale horror. "Your Grace," Evelyn finally managed, her voice trembling, stripped of all its theatrical polish. She stepped forward, ignoring her son's public execution entirely to save the business. "Please, if we could arrange a meeting on Monday, my husband would be delighted to host you. We can explain the Southwark margins." Henry didn't look at her. He didn't even shift his weight. He kept his eyes fixed on Preston, his expression one of mild, aristocratic disgust. "I don't do business with men who build on rotten foundations, Mrs. Harrington," Henry said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried effortlessly. "And I certainly don't dine with people who mistake cruelty for power." He finally turned his head, letting his pale eyes drag over Evelyn's plum gown and diamond necklace. "Your orchids are dying," Henry added smoothly. "I suggest you look to your own house." He turned his back on them. It was the ultimate, unforgivable insult in their circle. The physical, turning away. He offered his arm to Nora. Nora placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. Her heart was beating a steady, powerful rhythm against her ribs. The corset didn't feel like armor anymore. It felt like a spine. They walked back through the parted sea of guests, the silence holding until they reached the heavy mahogany doors of the entrance. No one tried to stop them. No one spoke. They left the Harringtons standing in the wreckage of their own carefully curated illusion. Cold, damp air hit Nora's face the moment the valet pulled the heavy doors open. She dragged it into her lungs, taking the deepest breath she had managed all evening. The cloying scent of roasted meat and heavy perfume was instantly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of London rain and wet asphalt. The Rolls-Royce idled at the bottom of the stone steps, its engine a low, comforting purr. Henry didn't speak as he guided her down the steps. The gravel crunched loudly beneath their feet, drowning out the faint, muffled thumping of the bass that still bled through the walls of the estate. The valet opened the rear door, keeping his eyes firmly averted. They slid into the cavernous, leather-scented dark of the cabin. The door slammed shut, severing them completely from the Harrington world. The car began to move, gliding smoothly down the long, spotlit driveway. Nora leaned her head back against the plush leather headrest. The streetlights outside strobed across the ceiling of the car in rhythmic flashes of yellow and shadow. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was the exhausted, companionable silence of two soldiers who had survived a mortar strike and were finally out of range. Nora looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking. The sharp edges of her rhinestone clutch didn't hurt her palms anymore. She opened her fingers, letting the bag drop onto the seat between them. "You didn't have to burn the Southwark deal," Nora said quietly, turning her head to look at Henry's shadowed profile. "That's millions of pounds, Henry. They will grovel if you let them. You could have bled them slowly." Henry turned his head. A passing streetlight illuminated the silver streaks in his hair and the deep, tired lines around his eyes. He reached into his breast pocket, pulling out the silver cigarette case. He traced the embossed crest with his thumb, a meditative, grounding gesture. "Money is just dirt, Nora. It's what you build on it that matters," he said, his voice lacking the sharp, aristocratic bite he'd weaponized in the ballroom. He sounded entirely human. "Besides, I never intended to sell that leasehold to them. They install floating staircases in buildings that deserve oak. It's a crime against architecture." A laugh startled out of Nora, warm and entirely genuine. It bubbled up from her chest, filling the dark space of the car. Henry watched her, a slow, asymmetric smile, breaking the severe lines of his face. "I think," Nora breathed, wiping a stray tear of mirth from the corner of her eye, that you might be exactly as arrogant as they thought you were. I am a duke, he replied dryly, putting the case back into his pocket. We are contractually obligated to be somewhat unbearable. The drive back to the city was a blur of neon signs in rain-slicked concrete. When the rolls finally turned onto Nora's narrow, dimly lit street, the contrast was violently apparent. There were no manicured lawns here. There were overflowing garbage bins, flickering street lamps, and the smell of damp brick. The car glided to a stop outside her studio building. Nora looked out the window at the frosted glass of her door. Just a few hours ago, she had felt like a hostage inside that room, trapped by a gold-foiled piece of cardstock. Now, it just looked like a workshop. It looked like hers. Henry shifted, reaching across the space between them. He didn't grab her hand. He gently brushed his knuckles against the severe line of her jaw. His touch, feather-light and startlingly warm against her cool skin. You were terrifying in there, Henry murmured, his pale eyes holding hers in the gloom. I merely provided the lighting. You burned the house down. Nora held his gaze. She didn't feel the urge to look away, to shrink back into the shadows. Thank you for forcing me to put on the armor. Keep the dress, he said softly, his thumb briefly tracing the curve of her cheekbone before he pulled his hand back. It suits you. Nora stepped out of the car. The night air was freezing, biting through the silk, but she didn't shiver. She stood on the cracked pavement and watched the massive, vintage Rolls-Royce pull away, its red taillights bleeding into the wet darkness until they turned a corner and vanished. She turned and unlocked the door to her studio. The familiar scent of harsh turpentine, linseed oil, and old dust washed over her. She flipped the light switch. The harsh fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, illuminating her scarred workbench, the dirty teacups, and the half-restored portraits leaning against the walls. There, sitting exactly where she had left it, was the cream envelope with the gold foil embossing. Nora walked over to the workbench. She picked up the heavy cardstock. It felt different now. It didn't feel like a summons, and it didn't feel like a weapon. It just felt like cheap paper, coated in a thin layer of fake gold. Without a second thought, she dropped the invitation into the trash bin beneath her desk. She unclasped the heavy green dress, letting it fall in a pool of silk around her feet, and reached for her stained denim apron. She had a portrait to restore, and for the first time in 14 months, her hands were perfectly, entirely steady. If you love this story of vengeance, healing, and the ultimate power move, please like this video. Share it with anyone who needs a reminder that the best revenge is realizing your own worth. Subscribe to our channel for more raw, deeply human storytelling, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new drama. Drop a comment below. What would you have said to Preston?